Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. We have reached part 2 in our mini-series with the historian Chris Clark about the revolutions that swept Europe in 1848. Last time we talked about the liberal revolution and the liberal revolutionaries. Today, we're talking about the radicals, the socialists, the people who were going to come to be known as Marxists, the firebrands, but also the ordinary people, the working people, the common people, who had simply had enough with their lot and the way they were expected to live. How did they all react? In the last episode, Chris, you just mentioned in passing the social question. And that's probably a good place to start this conversation about the radicalization of the 1848 revolutions. So before these revolutions broke out, people talked a lot about the social question. What was the question? What did they think the question was?
Well, the question was actually like a lot of questions of this era. There's a rather good book about this, about the questions of the 19th century, the Jewish question, the bullion question, the woman question, and so on, the Polish question, you name it. And like all these other capital Q questions, it was actually not a question. It was a bundle of questions, a constellation of questions, whatever metaphor you want. And so it was about things like, what effect was factory labor having on the health of the working classes, occupational diseases and accidents, the effect on children of labor from very early age. Children frequently worked from 5 and 6, 7 years of age. How did that affect their health? The effect of the decline of religion and of morals alleged among working class people, the effect of the close proximity between women and men in lots of factory contexts, the health effects, the public health effects of extremely insalubrious dwellings, overcrowded houses, basement rooms with filth and mire everywhere, this kind of thing. And of course, the phenomenon of poverty, but for which they used what was then a neologism, pauperization, pauperisierung, pauperisation. You find it every pauperisation. What it meant was not poverty as such, because poverty had always been there. People had always been poor. What was meant by pauperization was the systematic immiseration of entire social groups, even though they were working. Traditional poverty was about bad luck. You break a leg and it doesn't heal properly and you can never work again. Your husband dies, so you lose the chief breadwinner, men's wages being much higher than women's. You become ill, whatever, or there's a bad harvest and so on. These are temporary and sort of providential disasters which have to do with luck and ill fortune. But by pauperization, people meant the apparently deepening poverty of entire social groups, such as, for example, certain classes of artisans. Why were weavers, for example, in so many parts of Europe, why were they apparently so poor that they're unable to sustain themselves and to feed their children in a reasonable way, even though they're working all the hours that God sends? Why was the value of labor declining? These are the sorts of questions that fed into the social question. So the problem of what we now call in-work poverty. So some of these issues have actually come back to us today. That's one of the curious things about 1848 is its weird contemporary resonances. So that was what the questions were. But it's important to note that the social question wasn't just a sort of question about real life, real world things. It was also a way of seeing the world. It was a style, a documentary style, I suppose we could call it. And so people who contributed to the discourse of the social question, you can tell that they're in that discourse, not just by the subject matter, the fact that they're talking about, young girls working in a factory or impoverished weavers. It's also the style, this what we would now call the realist style. It's not just that you note that these people are poor. You have to count how many thalers do they earn every week? How much do they have to pay for rent? How much does light cost? How much does food cost? How exactly did they get the injury that prevents them from working? What size is their dwelling? How many windows are in it? What items of furniture can be seen? So there's a whole kind of cult-like attachment to meticulous description, and it's very metonymic. If you describe one thing, then you describe the thing that's next to it. There's a broken table with only 3 legs, and there's a jug with a hole in it. Then there's some candles, 2 candles, and then some dirty clothes for a child, and then a filthy bed in which children are wriggling, and so on. So there's a whole style, a whole way of seeing the world that was part of the social question. And it's in a way the predecessor of what would later be called realism. I mean, the realism which takes off after the 1848 revolutions begins as a literary style in the 1830s and 40s. And it's such an affecting and attractive style for people who are consuming it, for bourgeois readers, that it breaks the boundaries of, documentary description in official reports and papers and essays about social questions. It breaks the boundaries of that genre and spreads into fiction. So you have great fictional works of social description, like, for example, Eugène Sue's Les Mystères de Paris, which has appeared like a Dickens novel in many sequels over several years, but was notable for its extremely meticulous descriptions of working class environments in Paris. And it was a bestseller and so influential that people published similar descriptions, not fictional ones, but real social descriptions of the poor areas of Berlin, called the Mysteries of Berlin, the Mysteries of Breslau, the Mysteries of Vienna. Everywhere, cities vied to describe their own mysteries, the mysteries of poverty and of the poorest classes as meticulously as they could. So that was the social question, a kind of bundle of issues plus a way of seeing and thinking about the world that involved meticulous description, the tabulation of data, quite sophisticated statistics. So the social question is one of the spaces in which statistical calculations based on averages start to become widely understood. Life expectancy, for example, is one of the calculations many social question commentators bring to the task of this description. So it's a really interesting and rich phenomenon in European awareness in the 1830s and 40s.
Were the producers and the consumers of this stuff doing it self-consciously as outsiders? Presumably they were. I think some of it is a bit voyeuristic, isn't it? I mean, maybe not the dry statistical stuff, but some of the rest of it. And as you say, it's the mysteries. It's mysterious. This world exists in your world, but you're not aware of it. Was it also paranoid? I mean, was there a sense that this thing that they were trying to understand, to tabulate, to record, was also potentially the dynamite underneath the societies in which they lived?
Oh, very much so. How exactly that combination of moralizing and emotion and also of anger, partisan anger and so on, how exactly that mixture played out depended on your political standpoint. And the political standpoints varied enormously. The social question is neutral vis-a-vis politics. It can be inhabited by any political position. So on one hand, you have someone like Honoré Frégier, who was a policeman, effectively employed by the police administration of Paris, who wrote a book called The Dangerous Classes. And in a way that it's all in the title, and the idea was the poor are poor because they are lazy and vicious and they can't really plan. They don't plan for the future. They never save up for some kind of future eventualities or arm themselves against misfortune. They just live from one day to the next like a grasshopper. And no wonder things are so terrible. And of course, then they very quickly turn to vice. They're prone to alcoholism. The women go into prostitution and so on. And masturbation begins very early in life amongst the working class, according to Frégier, who seems to have had an almost supernatural understanding of these things. But the point is that, that was the conservative view. The poor are poor in a way because they're just so useless. And against that, you had people like a man called Burin, for example, who wrote a very widely read tract against Frégier, replying to him saying, how are people supposed to plan for the future if they have to consume, simply in order to live, everything they earn every day? If there is no surplus, if there's nothing left over, they will live in a very different temporality from people who can save for the future. They can't possibly save for anything. And if occasionally a man drinks a bottle of absinthe, or how can we blame him amidst all his misery for seeking that comfort? So there were very different perspectives brought to bear on this. And what Frégier saw as vice, a vicious addiction to fornication and so on, others identified as an economic necessity, that young women of the working classes, were pressed into prostitution by the absence of any alternative means of supporting themselves, because women's wages really were not life-sustaining. They were even less than male proletarian wages, the assumption being that a woman ought to be supported either by her parents or by her husband, and women who were not in that position really were in a desperate strait. And so the argument was often made. Engels, for example, observed that prostitution was a consequence of the immiseration of the working class and not some sign of inherent vice. So how people read the causation, the causal relationships, and how they balanced diagnosis and moralizing depended on where they were coming to the social question from. And the social question gave off, in turn, polarizing energies as people's diagnoses placed them on this position or that on a spectrum of responses to the issues that it posed. So it's a complicated thing that was energizing politics and basically helping people to sharpen and refine their positions vis-a-vis each other across quite a broad spectrum of attitudes to the current immiseration that everybody was observing as a feature of their world.
Was there any kind of consensus that this wasn't sustainable, in the sense that, as you say, poverty is always with us, but there were novel forms of poverty here, which clearly had something to do with industrialization, the changing nature of the labor force, urban environments. And therefore, these people were recording something new. And in the novelty, was there also a sense that something had to give? I mean, even if you were someone who thought it was a question of vice and immorality, nonetheless, it didn't look sustainable, did it? To anyone.
No, what everybody had in common who came to the social question was a deep sense of anxiety. Before I move on to answer your question, I wanted to come back to something else you said, which I thought was very interesting when you referred to voyeurism. I think one of the interesting things about this discourse is it's a third-person discourse. It's what will we do? What should we do about them? Right. I've been to their houses. You don't know how they live. I've been there and I've seen how they live, and it's absolutely appalling. What are we going to do about them? So it was never generated by the people themselves who were in this situation. It was generated by concerned middle class observers, often with a sort of voyeuristic pleasure and a generated, I think, pleasure in readers, which explains the enormous success of this genre, both as a form of documentation, but also as a literary phenomenon.
So today we'd call it poverty porn. I mean, there is a genre which is poverty porn, the kind of TV series about how people live on Benefit Street, and it's for middle-class voyeurs.
It really is. I think most people agreed it wasn't sustainable, but their proposed solutions show how differently they viewed the etiology of the situation. So, on the one hand, you had conservatives who said this is all the result of liberal tampering with the old corporate structure of society. The state got too big for its boots, and the old system of guilds and the layered corporate society of orders in which people's status was defined in terms of duties to the society as a whole, which varied from one status to another, and people acquired their personal status from their membership of larger corporate entities. The destruction of all that had left a kind of atomized soup of humans, which was just dumped into a condition of misery by the modern industrial system. Others, like liberals, for example, tended to say, well, the problem is not too much deregulation and the departure from the corporate structure. The problem is not enough deregulation. What we need is to truly deregulate markets and truly open them up and increase infrastructure and start moving capital and goods and people around more easily. And then we will escape from this trap, the poverty trap that we're currently in, or pauperization trap that we're currently in. And of course, socialists or people at the socialist end of the spectrum, they argued that the problem was, what we would now call capitalism. They didn't always use the term capitalism, and Marx and Engels obviously were already working towards a sophisticated analysis of what capitalism was and how it caused immiseration. But you also had other socialists who were talking about, not about capitalism, but about the modern industrial system. That was Louis Blanc's term, for example. And he said the industrial system is a system of extermination. And he said it's an exterminatory system because it depends on competition. And until we dispense with competition and move towards a cooperative, associative form of life, we will continue to treat human beings as dispensable chattels.
Do you think there was a view that socialist answers to the social question at this period were inherently revolutionary? Because there's a way of reading what socialism is, which is it takes the social in the social question deadly seriously. And it is the ism of the social, a vision of society, which stands in opposition to political solutions. That the solutions will have themselves to have a social origin. Now, that could be a revolutionary doctrine. It's a kind of rejection of the political system. Or there's a way of thinking of it, and Marx would call some of this early socialism utopian for precisely this reason, that actually it's sort of shying away from politics and it's trying to think about change in purely social terms. At this point, I mean, socialism comes to be seen in the 19th century as a revolutionary doctrine, but at this point, If your answer to the social question was to ism the socialism, did that make you a revolutionary, or might it make you?
Not necessarily. I mean, the interesting thing is that socialism in that era, it's always problematic to paraphrase Mao in these contexts, but it was a garden in which, many, many blooms were blooming. And if everybody agreed on anything about socialism, it was that there was no single definition. And there is a major study of socialism in France in 1845 by a German scholar, Lorenz Stein, who would later be Lorenz von Stein, but at that time he was still just Stein. He opens with this observation that we don't really know what socialism is, but he goes on to say exactly what you just said, that socialism is the privileging of the social. And one of the points he made about socialism was that it represented the arrival of the social as an object of contemplation. And so that, in a way, is what socialism is in its essence in this period, and that does not imply a revolutionary agenda. And in fact, people like Louis Blanc, like many people of his generation, they remembered very clearly, or they had a very clear folk memory of how the French Revolution had lurched from a sort of mild liberal revolution to a sort of blood-soaked terrorist statism of the Jacobin Convention. And he had no desire to see that happen, and he believed that socialism could be achieved through incremental reforms and through the introduction of the principle of association and through the corporate organization of labor. For him, the key thing was the organization of labor. It didn't have to be a revolutionary process. There were others too who spoke about the need to, like Weitling, for example, the German Christian socialist, who spoke about the need to overcome the tyranny of money and so on. But it wasn't really a theory of revolution or of insurrection. So there were insurrectionaries who were planning for insurrections, and there were several insurrections before 1848 run by or launched by people on the left. In Paris, there was one in 1832 and another in 1834 and another in 1839. So there was a sort of, drumbeat of hard left insurrections, but they didn't get anywhere. They weren't successful. And by and large, socialism was rather separate from this kind of insurrectionist activity and was basically a very multiplicitous and multifarious form of thinking about what is a good life. I mean, that's what strikes you about a lot of the writings of this era. Alongside, there are utopian dimensions. I mean, I don't think we should accept Marx's dismissal of everybody before Marx as completely useless. But nevertheless, there is a sort of utopian throb, a sort of utopian vibe to a lot of this socialist writing. And some of it is actually overtly eschatological. I mean, Weitling, for example, ends with fantasies about or visions of the return of Christ in the form of a radicalized proletarian and so on. But there was also a lot of thinking about what is dignified labor, what is dignity in labor, how should the imbalance between labor and capital be redressed, how are different forms of emancipation. For example, Flora Tristan was writing about whether the emancipation of women might not also bring in its wake the emancipation of the proletariat, or the other way around. Were different forms of emancipation or the emancipation of different groups, to what extent were they causally interlocked? And so there's a lot of thinking about that. But it's not necessarily revolutionary. It hasn't really committed itself to a politics in that sense, though it is political in the sense that it is a critique of the existing order.
When the revolutions broke out in 1848, let's call them the liberal revolutions, was the pressure to radicalize what had happened, primarily, if we think of this in terms of the social question, coming from the viewers or the viewed? That is, you've got two things going on here. There appear on the streets of Paris many of the people who have been studied and scrutinized and turned into units of data in the analysis of those who are undertaking the social question. But here they are, and now they have a voice. I mean, they're on the streets, maybe incoherent, but they're making noise. At the same time, around the revolution, you have people who've been thinking for years, for decades, about what the social question might require by way of radical change. Do you think the radicalization of the revolution, as it happens through 1848, is primarily driven by the revolution allowing a voice for the people who to this point had simply been studied? Or is it actually coming from the intellectuals, the scrutinizers of the poor?
I think by and large, sadly, it is the latter rather than the former. There are barricades on which people die. Over 300 people perish in the fighting with the troops in Berlin and so on. And the great majority of those are not middle-class bourgeois of the type who composed tracts about the social question. They are themselves working people, but a lot of them are actually artisans of some kind. So they're not really in the proletariat proper. They are skilled artisans who did not associate themselves with unskilled laborers. The hierarchy among people we might think of as working class was a very deep, a tottering and deep hierarchy in which people did not recognize themselves as sharing the same fate. And so if you were a journeyman shoemaker, that was a very different situation to be in from, for example, someone who just made their way by occasional labor whenever they could pick labor up. There are plenty of people like that, but they did not belong to anything like the same social universe as skilled laborers, skilled workers in the crafts. And among weavers, silk weavers, and so on, there are endless differences of status within those groups. So it's not a single group. But what you do see, though, if you look at the lists of the dead and so on in the opening salvos of the revolution in February and March, then they are dominated by people of that, either of that artisan class or by proletarians. It's not by and large professors and doctors and so on and journalists. It's washerwomen and journeymen, trainee artisans, in other words, and apprentices and the occasional master artisan. Their master artisans are quite rare because they already have, in most cases, a satisfied existence in some sense. So it's a kind of complex sociology in that revolt. It's important that these people are there because without them, the liberal revolution couldn't happen. And the liberals knew that, and the radicals knew that. But neither the liberals nor the radicals were really out there on the barricades. They were watching this happen. And they saw that the desperation of working class folk, or I mean, we don't really even have a very good term for this, but the desperation of many people in those poorer strata of the population was a major driver up of upheaval in flashpoint moments. But that was their role, and their role was to go into the streets, then retreat, then go into the streets again, then retreat, to provide the petroleum to keep the flame burning every now and then. But by and large, not to lead the revolution.
But the sense of betrayal that emerged through the summer of 1848, we talked about it a bit last time, that the liberal revolution had got stalled, it had got stuck. It had got stuck in these parliaments, it got stuck in talk, it had got stuck in tinkering with constitutions, many of which already existed and were just being refined. That sense of betrayal, was it essentially being articulated on behalf of the workers by people who identified themselves as radicals rather than by the workers themselves?
Well, workers did organize in many places. There were clubs which had workers in them. There was a very interesting phenomenon in Paris called the Luxembourg Commission, which was placed under the leadership of Louis Blanc, who was a minister in the provisional government and who was asked to take charge of this. And it was a commission entrusted with the task of working out how to improve the lot of France's working people. And that Luxembourg Commission, a number of studies of that have been done, and it actually did a great deal more than anybody had imagined. It became a kind of parliament where working class people were invited to testify to their own problems, their own understanding of the issues that troubled them most. So it became a kind of clearinghouse for actual real life discussions by working class people of what their lives were like and what the problems were that affected them as a group, not just individually. So there were opportunities for that to happen. There was also something called the Handwerker Congress, which came together in Frankfurt, though it had to quickly split into two different congresses because the journeymen and the apprentices didn't want to meet together with the masters. So there again, you see these hierarchies, they're often divided people that are thought of as working people from each other. And even in that group, of course, completely unskilled, the poorest of the poor, completely unskilled people were not part of those sorts of forms of mobilization. So, yes, there is some organization by them as well as on their behalf. But by and large, when it comes to, for example, in the June days in Paris in 1848, there is a genuinely proletarian uprising, which is then extremely violently put down. The leaders of the left stand aside from that uprising. They can't understand it. They think it's crazy. Why would you rise up against an elected parliament, which is itself the result of a revolution? They are shocked and grieved by this act of desperation and by its very, very bloody aftermath. Thousands were killed in the suppression of this upheaval. So the divide never quite closes between those who want to talk about the social question and those who are its subject matter and who lived the social question. Vienna is a very interesting case because in Vienna, when they buried the victims of the revolution after the first few days of the revolution in March in 1848, there was a big burial ceremony and so on, but they only buried people who died inside the walled city of Vienna, in the city center, fighting against the troops. But a lot of people had died out in the suburbs. These were proletarians who had, for example, set fire to the gas pipelines and smashed tax collection houses and engaged in all kinds of slightly anarchical, also attacks on the houses and equipment of companies regarded as bad employers. Those people were quickly attacked by student legionaries and national guards who'd been organized as a consequence of the revolution in the center of Vienna. They then sallied forth from the city and helped to put down the proletarian tumults on the edge of this big conurbation of Vienna. And they did not see those people that they were attacking as in any sense involved in a common enterprise with the people who fought and died in Vienna itself, even though those people who fought and died included proletarians of exactly the kind who were fighting outside the city gates. So it's a very complex picture in which large coalitions of sympathy face a lot of impediments. It's very hard for them to grow together.
What was the desperation that provoked the June Day? So as you say, it baffled in some ways the intellectual leaders of the radical wing of the revolution because they weren't living it. It looked not just quixotic, but doomed. But something triggered it. What triggered it?
It was triggered in part by this sense, and you've already touched on this, that it's what, in the aftermath of 1830, a typical, really important key phrase on the left had been La Révolution escamotée, the hijacked, the stolen revolution. The people gave the Liberals this upheaval, the Liberals capitalized on it, but then they abandoned the people who'd heaved them into power, hoisted them into power. And there's a sense that this is happening again, and that life is not getting better for the poorest. But there was also a flashpoint, a sort of trigger, and that was the decision to abandon the system of public works institutions known as the Ateliers Nationaux, the national workshops, which had been set up as a sort of sop to the far left. In the first days of the revolution, at the end of February, the provisional government agrees to create these Ateliers Nationaux in order to see to the welfare of the working populace, and in particular people who don't have work, and so on. And this looks like a sop to Louis Blanc, who'd called for the organization of labor. But in fact, what happens is something that has nothing to do with Blanc's thoughtful association-based vision of a more just society. Rather, it was just an old-fashioned style, workhouse-style Victorian solution to poverty, which is to give large numbers of unemployed men in the Parisian arrondissement access to tasks which varied in usefulness. Some of them were completely useless, digging out holes and then filling them in again. But there were lots of other tasks people were set to doing, clearing roads and all this kind of thing. And by the summer, the decision had been reached that this was costing too much. France deeply resented the extra tax levied in order to finance these public works programs, and not just in Paris, there were other cities that ran them as well. And so it was feared that in the end this was going to sort of destroy the revolution, and so the decision was made to shut the Ateliers Nationaux down, which is what happened. And it's in the aftermath of the consternation triggered by that triggers this insurrection of despair. In a sense, they ought to have known that this would happen, because the whole purpose of the Ateliers Nationaux had been to control otherwise anarchic and uncontrollable working class men. And once you took away that method of controlling them, namely paying them a tiny dole every day for doing not very much, you opened the situation up to something much worse. And that's what happened. And the person called in to put that down was a man by the name of Cavaignac, who was given dictatorial powers, temporarily dictatorial powers, and used them to do this job in the most brutal way imaginable.
The geography of this it's quite hard to sort of map it out, because you've just described the central events of the revolutions, both the liberal revolution and then these radical turns which then have to be suppressed. And the focus of them tends to be city centres, as it often is in revolutionary scenarios, particular squares, particular locations, the locations of the revolution. Then lapping around the edges of that, you've got something potentially more radical. The suburbs are not, it's not Surbiton, it's not where the bourgeoisie live. The suburbs are places where the poverty and the desperation might inspire acts of violence which drive the revolution in a more radical direction, but then require the centre to repress those. And then lapping around the edges of that, you've got another way in which the poor, among others, were given a voice, which is the extended franchise. So through all of this, you also have people starting to access the views of those outside of the cities. The peasantry, the poor, you touched on this last time. One of the deeply ironic features of 1848 is, as the franchise was radically expanded to include people who had never been included before. To the surprise of those who had been observing poverty, it turned out that many of them were small c conservatives and not radicals at all. So is it too crude to say you've got a centre to these revolutions where the drama is happening? You've got a kind of radical periphery, and then round the radical periphery, you have an even broader periphery, which actually turns out to be something that limits the radicalism, because the gap between the urban and the rural poor turns out, and we discover this through elections, to be pretty wide.
Absolutely. It turns out that the social question was really an urban question. It was a question about cities, and very few people had given serious thought to rural poverty. I mean, there are some studies of rural poverty, but they don't have the salience for contemporary awareness that the urban social question had. And, sure enough, when the revolutionary commissars, who in France, for example, are entrusted with going out into the countryside to communicate the great good tidings of revolution to the benighted rustics of the French provinces, they are shocked by the sort of, as they see it, I mean, they see these people as benighted rustics, that's not my view, but when they turn up and explain, we've been doing marvelous things for you, we're putting together a constitution, we've got freedom of the press and so on, they notice the audiences don't seem especially impressed. And I mean, mainly what they have to do is find people after church, because otherwise people in the countryside don't tend to be in one place. They're scattered out across hamlets and farms and so on. So you've got to get them when they're together. Even doing that is difficult. And there's one report from one of these commissars that I found very interesting, where the commissar reports that he's explained to them what the revolution's achieved on their behalf. And then he says, do you have any questions? And one person says, will we be allowed to pasture our pigs in the Forêt de la whatever, just a little way down the river? And he says, I don't know. And he writes back and says, I explained to them, I told them about the Constitution, and they asked me about pigs. I mean, these people are complete imbeciles. They have absolutely no politics in them. And this is a problem that many revolutionaries faced, was that they didn't even have the beginnings of an understanding of the problems that mattered for rural people. There's a very interesting because he's an exception to this rule, called Hans Kutlich, who was active in the Austrian revolutionary setting in Vienna and became a member of the Reichstag, the youngest member to be elected to the Reichstag, to the Revolutionary Assembly in Vienna. And he was interesting because his father was a peasant who'd been on a servile tenure and had to give labor services to his landlord, who was also his seigneur, his lord. And he really understood the rural problem and, well, the great variety of rural problems. I mean, this is, by the way, part of the problem for the rural problem, is that it was immensely various and hugely diverse, and local laws and customs and what the issues were. Was it about access to the commons? Was it about the privatization of formerly shared property? Was it about pasturing pigs? Was it about access to fall wood? I mean, there were endless potential issues depending on which bit of geography these issues had been simmering in for the previous sort of 4 or 5 centuries. And so the sheer diversity made it difficult to absorb. But Kudlich made the point that it was just absurd of radical leaders to go out to the countryside and hold a speech that was like as he put it, a clever speech you might give in a lawyer's club, and expect these people to kindle to your words. I mean, he said it's just absolutely nonsensical. He said what you have to do if you want to communicate with the peasants is you have to go to where they actually are and sit down with a small group of them and talk to them. But most importantly, listen to them. Don't speak first. Sit there and let them tell you what their problems are. So there really was, in a way, not even the beginning of a proper dialogue about these questions. But humans are a learning species, and it must be said that after the ebbing away of the élan of the first wave of the revolution in France, in the following year, 1849, 1850, there are some examples of successful radicalization of rural populations. Once they've learned how to operate networks in the countryside, they do get quite good at it. But in 1848, they hadn't really even begun to learn how to do that.
Outside of France, which was a Republican revolution, almost all the other ones weren't in the end. They had to accommodate themselves to the continued existence of monarchical regimes, the regimes that liberals tried to tame or to direct, or whatever it was. Was part of the problem the lingering attachment to those regimes, to kings, among the people in these places? So, for instance, going out into the countryside was one of the things that was discovered, as well as a deep attachment to traditional forms of religion, a far greater attachment than might have been visible at the heart of the city to kings.
Absolutely. I mean, monarchy is a kind of emotional fact whose power in the 19th century is extremely impressive. I mean, this is a very monarchical century. It's also a century of Republican revolution if you look at the French case, but it is still a very powerful institution, and it is anchored in people's sentiments. And in the countryside, there was still deep attachment. I mean, Bismarck tells, doubtless, somewhat, there's a bit of spin in this story, obviously, but he recalls how the news of the revolution arrived on his estate, and how he went out to tell his peasants that the king had been, as he put it, taken prisoner by radicals in the city. And the peasants said, "Let's go and free the king." And they went and got their scythes and their pitchforks and said, "Let's march to Berlin." And the point Bismarck was making was that actually, if you go outside the cities and what you described as a sort of with their radical suburban fringe, and you go back into the countryside, you can reach a place where it seems as if the revolution has never happened, and attachments to monarchy and to throne and altar, as the German phrase went, remained intact. That was a great benefit, in some ways, a great advantage for the ruling houses of Europe, was that they could withdraw from cities into country seats of one form or another and recharge their batteries. That's what the Habsburgs did. They went to Bad Ischl or to Olmütz, now Olomouc in the Czech Republic. You could always get away from the kerfuffle. Once you got into the countryside, it was almost as if none of this had happened.
And insofar as these were also national religions, indeed nationalist religions, did it devolve into a kind of contest to speak for the nation between king and people versus parliament or legislature and another version of the people? And the trouble for the revolutionaries was that the first version of the nation was more capacious in lots of ways than the second. Maybe with the second, there were more direct forms of representation, in the sense that the parliaments could claim to speak for particular groups in a more direct and vocal way. But if this was going to be national revolution in the name of national liberation, in the end, it advantaged the people who could speak for everyone.
That's true. And I think that, again, as ever with 1848, there's always that problem that you can always say, but not in the South, I think. In 1848, there are some interesting exceptions. I mean, the Wallachian Revolution, which takes place in what is now Romania, so the capital city there was Bucharest, that revolution was marked by a very high degree of sensitivity to the rural question, the land question, the need to address the needs of the peasantry. And they even went so far as to organize a kind of summit. Summit's the wrong word, but a kind of congress where peasants and landowners came together to discuss ways out of the impasse of rural poverty and how to achieve land reform without completely smashing the system. But that was a very unusual example. Almost everywhere else, the revolution isolated itself by the elite quality of its most important spokesmen, by their inability really to expand their horizons to absorb either the problem of social want in the urban context or the gnarly and endlessly various problems afflicting rural communities. And of course, exploiting this divide or this failure to connect the people on the hard left who say, you said before that the Liberals said, engaged in too much chatting. Of course, one doesn't want to join in making that accusation, because talking is actually very, very important in politics, and discussing things before you make a decision is actually a very good idea, and consultative and collegiate decisions are by and large of better quality and more likely to appear legitimate than simply acts of caprice. But the hard left had the option, and they used it too. They were smart about this, of, as it were, capitalizing on this disconnect by saying, this is just talk, talk, talk. These are the money bags. The Parlament was what one radical poet called the parliament in Frankfurt. The Parlament, die Schwätzerei hat da kein End. The chit-chat never ends in the Parlament. So this idea that it is just all talk and nobody's there who really cares about you, the people. So that is one of the tragedies of the revolution, is this failure to make connections between different constituencies. And that happens in part because of fear, because the Liberals are too busy fearing the people to really be able to absorb this broader menu of demands. And that there's a real lesson there for contemporary politics. This tendency to shut down, the tendency to call people on the left communists, for example. There's an interesting study by a Danish historian of how the word communist is used as a sort of bully word, a word to frighten people with, even though the vast majority of people in the socialist end of the political spectrum were not at all communists. They were much more like ancestors of today's social democrats. So that failure to connect and failure to cross boundaries and speak to each other and, more importantly, listen to each other is one of the really sad things. These are very loquacious revolutions, but people are often talking past each other rather than to each other.
Was there also a failure to connect radical politics with something that had been going on long before 1848, which is emancipation movement? So if you look at the history of the first half of the 19th century, there's also a story to be told about leaving aside the social question, which tended not exclusively to study male urban workers, but that was a lot of the focus of it, to look at the question of the emancipation of chattel slaves, the emancipation of women, the emancipation of Jews. Those movements, which predate 1848 and exist long after 1848, exist to this day. Did the revolution connect with that, or did the revolution somehow talk past that as well?
No, the revolution, it connects with it in the sense that it was interesting what you said about the previous history, the sort of prior history of these movements, because they do have a very interesting temporal shape. The movement to achieve the abolition of slavery, for example, in the French Empire takes off in the late 18th century. It's one of the strands of the Enlightenment. It's never a mass movement, but never anything to compare with what happens in Britain in the 1820s and 30s. But nevertheless, it flares up in the late 18th century and then sort of ebbs away again in the Napoleonic era. The early flowering of feminism takes place in exactly that same period. But then there's an ebbing away after 1815. There's some early discussions of Jewish emancipation or the removal of civil disabilities weighing on the Jewish minorities in the European states, but that also ebbs away in the 18 teens and 20s. But then these issues all come alive again in the context of the 1848 revolution. The women get active, founding newspapers, joining political associations. It had been illegal to do either of those things for a woman before that. Jews become active in their own interest for the first time. They're a Jewish spokesman for Jewish rights. They're also simply very able and eloquent politicians of Jewish extraction, Jewish background, who are elected, for example, to mandates in the Frankfurt Parliament or in the Nationalversammlung, the National Assembly, as it's called in Berlin, the Prussian Assembly. And so, there's a lot happening on all of these fronts. And of course, in the case of abolition, the abolition of enslaved people, that is the most drastic and dramatic transition, because one of the first things the provisional government does is in Paris, is to create a commission to deal with this question of abolition under the presidency of a man called Victor Schœlcher, who is a principled abolitionist and has been for many years, a major publicist in favor of abolition, and who loses no time in, with an unconditional decree of abolition, bringing an end to slavery as a political system, for example, in the French Caribbean, but also in Senegal, in the other French possessions. What that actually means in practice, of course, is another question. And the emancipation, it turns out that abolition and emancipation are not the same for enslaved people. It's one thing, it's not an easy thing, but it is one thing to sign a decree of abolition as an act of government in Paris on one sunny morning in the spring of 1848, and very much another to deal with the entrenched effects of racism and racial hierarchy in these societies that have been deeply marked by centuries of slavery. And in those places, formerly enslaved people remain subject to a whole range of extra legal controls which limit their ability to emancipate themselves. So it's a complex picture. There is a sort of flowing together of emancipatory agendas with the general revolutionary tumult, but it's an incomplete linkage. It's an imperfect linkage, which is interesting because the word emancipation had become one of the it had become one of those words. It's not the only one. There are lots of others, history, class, and so on, which in the middle of the 19th century become words through which history flows. They get saturated with time and change. And one of them is the word emancipation. And you had lots of people speaking of emancipation in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s saying, this is the concept of our era, that everybody's going to be emancipated. This is the bridge that leads into the future. And there is no other way into the future but via the emancipation of all kinds of different groups. But that idea of a general emancipation, intersectional is what we would now call it, where everybody's emancipated together, that never happens. And in fact, doesn't even begin to happen. And it's interesting that the radical men of 1848, for example, a tiny, vanishingly small minority of them take any interest in the emancipation of women. There's a marvelous essay by Heinrich Heine, the great Jewish German poet, one of the most fascinating and likable people of the mid-19th century. He said, the age of emancipation will emancipate the enslaved people of the Caribbean. It will emancipate the Catholics of Britain. It will emancipate the Jews of Frankfurt. But he never mentioned women. So intersectionality remained a distant, distant, distant dream. Though there were people dreaming that dream, but they were women and they were not numerous.
When you look back on 1848, 1849, do you see it as a set of missed opportunities, or that the failure of these things to come together, the liberal and the radical, the central and the suburban, the city and the countryside, the radical and the emancipatory, all of these things are swirling around together. All of these things are themselves intersecting with each other. And yet it doesn't coalesce. In the end, it fractures. And we're going to talk next time about the counter-revolution. When you look back on it, do you have, even as a historian, a sense of frustration at the missed opportunity that this represents? Or does it feel like it pretty much got as far as it could go, and the barriers in the way of these things coming together in the middle of the 19th century were very deep and almost insuperable? Actually, these people were heroic in their attempt to overcome these barriers, and they got as far as they could.
I'm glad you gave me that choice, and especially since you put the second choice so eloquently, you make it easier to embrace. I mean, I think basically I'm with the second option rather than the first. But I think this is not just intellectual. I think it's partly temperamental. Some historians enjoy kind of wagging their finger, their index finger, at the people of the past and saying, why didn't you see this? Why didn't you see that? You idiot. That's not really my way. And I always find myself being, amazed by how much people achieved rather than astonished that they didn't achieve more or disappointed by them. There is a way of thinking about these things that will condemn one to an eternity of disappointment. Whereas I prefer to be, I'm very impressed, for example, by the fact that women, although they got absolutely nothing out of the revolution, found newspapers, they founded clubs, and they created networks that would actually persist after the collapse of the revolutions and would remain latent, able to be mobilized again in the 1860s and 70s when the women's movement started to take off. Jewish networks did something quite similar and helped to carry the whole process of Jewish emancipation. So there are remarkable achievements in this revolution. It's just that they don't achieve what can't be achieved. That's really the fact of it. You can't make coherent a society which is not coherent. You have to do your best with the materials you have to hand. I do think if there are disappointments that are regrettable, I think it is the most important one is the readiness of the liberals to write off social demands as irrelevant to their project. They were smart enough to have done better than that, and I think they allowed their fear to get the better of them. I also think the radicals were too quick to attack and condemn the liberals, and they became too quickly impatient with parliamentary procedures and with parliaments as an instrument of change, because in the long run, of course, parliaments do bring about and have brought about, historically, deep social change. But people were in a hurry, they were frightened. A revolution isn't a great situation in which to make a revolution.
The third and final part of our series on 1848 with Chris Clark is going to be available tomorrow. It's about the counter-revolutions and the counter-revolutionaries, the people from the establishment, from the old regimes who fought back. We are putting that one out as a bonus episode for PPF Plus subscribers. To subscribe, all you have to do is go to our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description. You will get tomorrow's episode and all of our bonus episodes for all of our series over the past year. Here's a taster of what's coming tomorrow. The absorption of the social question by the state, if that was one of the consequences of 1848, that actually is the one that is the most profound.
I think it is a very profound consequence. I think that it's very interesting to think of these moments where technocracy emerges as an attractive solution. It's interesting to remember what it's a solution to. It was a solution because it seemed preferable to the conflictual politics of the 1840s. And a lot of people make this explicit. There's a well-known minister of finance in Portugal, a man called Fontes Pereira de Melo, who says, we've left behind us the era of rhetoric and shooting. And we've entered into uma nova politica, a new politics. And there's a lot of people talking about this. Marx and Engels write a big essay where they say, has anyone noticed how empty all those words that were being bandied about a couple of years ago, how empty these words turned out to be? Constitution, freedom, rights, family. It's all garbage. It's all just, these words are only sonorous because they're empty, like drums.
That'll be available on PPF Plus. In our regular slot next time, we're going to be talking about a revolution that in some ways dwarfs the events of 1848. It's the Taiping revolution in China that cost the lives of maybe 20 or 30 million people, an event on a simply mind-blowing scale. Our guide will be the historian Julia Lovell, historian of modern China, trying to make sense of the events themselves and the ideas that lay behind them. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.